If you picture a nuclear battlefield, the juiciest targets are big, high value, and static. Infrastructure, fortifications, and large units. Armies seek to concentrate at a decisive point to achieve local superiority in the attack or to repel an attack. But if everyone's slinging nukes, as the fear was in the 50s, clustering units close together was asking for an atomic strike. France's answer was Javelot, or javelin, a brigade and then division concept built on speed, firepower, and range of action to avoid and exploit nukes. It was similar to America's Pentomic concept, but Javelot predated it, had a different mission, and had way more speed. You could say the story starts during World War II, when the French army was remade in America's image, giving it a capable armored division and a maneuverist character. But I'll start in September of 1950. That month, France was conducting its Champagne maneuvers at Morbihan, experimenting with concepts it'd taken to the Cold War. But at that time, the more classic concern of massive Soviet armies outnumbering tiny France was at the forefront. The most interesting concept tested was a new mobile division. It compensated for numerical inferiority through maneuver. The division was smaller than a standard division and had a relatively weak protection, but theoretically had equal direct firepower and superior mobility. In the mobile defense, they'd attempt to delay the enemy long enough for the more powerful divisions to concentrate to repel them. However, as the 50s marched on, the nuclear question entered the picture. Following the Korean War, armies were reinventing themselves to stay relevant. In France the year the Korean War ended, Minister of National Defense RENÉ Plevin declared his nation's strategy must be based on the simultaneous use of conventional weapons and nuclear weapons. The mobile division concept led into the Light Mechanized Brigade, or the Javelot Brigade, as it was tested in 1953 and 1954 during the Javelot exercises. This was a light armored unit based primarily on the new AMX-13 light tanks, Panhard EBR reconnaissance vehicles, and anti-tank infantry on Unimogs, new entrant to the cute little guy club. Apparently the EBR was a bit of a mess during the Javelot 1 exercise, described in Senate reports and the press as a fiasco costing millions of francs, but they locked it in for Javelot 2. If you want an easier way to learn how such fiascos unfold, Ground News has the solution. The major social media platforms are just not good places to get news anymore, and seeking out a wide range of coverage is frankly a lot of work. Ground News not only shows you dozens of different sources on topics tailored to your interests, but tells you their political bias and shows you how much of the left, right, and center is covering a story. If an article is not being covered by a side, you might be missing out on coverage without Ground News. For example, French lawmakers recently condemned the 1961 Paris massacre carried out by French police during the Algerian War, a controversial topic. Ground News gives you headlines from many sources with their political leanings, factuality ratings, and ownership. News sites you may read from time to time could be owned by a mega conglomerate or an authoritarian government and you don't even realize. I especially appreciate that you can directly compare headlines to see how different agencies frame things. See who's more interested in making you angry than delivering you the news. So if you want an easier and better way to stay informed, go to ground.news/battleorder linked below and get 40% off the unlimited access Ground News Vantage plan. Heading over there helps me keep making videos too. But back to nuclear war in Europe. The Javelot Brigade was a traditional cavalry unit. Its primary missions were intelligence gathering, covering missions, basically aggressively protecting armored divisions, exploiting breakthroughs created by atomic fires, and raids in the enemy's rear. Frontages would be wider than ever on a nuclear battlefield, and the Javelot Brigade would have had to operate highly dispersed to make itself less of a viable target for nuking. Marshal Alphonse Juin, commander of NATO forces in Central Europe, put it as, "We're going to the battle of the Great Voids." Mechanized or air mobility would be used to rapidly concentrate for an attack or defense. Logistical lines would be stretched to the max, and uncertain in the best of times, so range of action without a resupply was paramount. The EBR would have an operational range of 500 to 600 kilometers, and the MX-13 a road range of 350 to 400 kilometers. more than double the range of the American M47 Patton and M24 Chaffee in French service. Of course, neither were on par with the main battle tank in terms of combat power, but that wasn't the point. Mobility over protection was the prevailing vibe. Command of the brigade was given to Colonel Francois Huet, a 1940 motorized cavalry group commander turned resistance leader who rose through the ranks after liberation. Javelot initially consisted of 2 combined arms regiments, a departure from how things were normally done, a way of tearing down the rivalry of arms, ensuring different types of units built habitual relationships and maintained unity of effort. The Javelot maneuvers sequence of events included the EBR recon vehicles making contact with the enemy, a heavy armored unit equipped with M47 Pattons. The enemy was then engaged by dispersed elements of AMX-13s, recon jeeps, and rocket launcher-armed anti-tank infantry on Unimogs. And then, AMX-13s conducted an attack against the enemy's flank, later linking up with paratroopers who dropped in to secure a junction ahead of them. With the concept validated, in February of 1955, the Experimental Brigade was expanded into a formal division through the addition of a 3rd Regiment and divisional troops. It was named the 7th Rapid Mechanized Division. Their insignia was a centaur wielding a javelin, used by the brigade during the Javelot maneuvers and still in use by the French 7th Armored Brigade. The 7th DMR consisted of 3 maneuver regiments: the 2nd Dragoon Regiment, the Colonial Tank Destroyer Regiment, and the 110th Colonial Infantry Regiment, quickly renamed the 21st Colonial Infantry Regiment in May 1955. The 2nd Dragoons and Colonial Tank Destroyers were Combined Arms Regiments, or RIAs, with 1 Command and Services Squadron, a Scout Squadron on Jeeps, 2 Tank Squadrons with 16 AMX-13s each, 2 anti-tank voltigeur companies, SS-10 ATGM teams on Unimogs, and 1 engineer liaison detachment. The 21st Colonial Infantry, meanwhile, was a mounted infantry regiment with 1 AMX-13 squadron and 4 infantry companies. Regiments would be habitually reinforced with a 105mm self-propelled artillery battery attached from the 72nd Artillery Group. The division also had the 3rd African Chasseur Regiment as a dedicated recon element, with a command and service squadron, and 3 Pinard EBR squadrons, each with 18 EBR armored cars and over 30 jeeps. Additional divisional troops included the division staff, 57th Headquarters Company, 457th Anti-Air Artillery Group with 40mm Bofors autocannons, 57th Signal Company, Engineer Battalion, Maintenance Company, and Service Battalion. 7th DMR was first validated in September of 1955 during the Eclair Maneuvers around the Swabian Alps of West Germany. Acting as Blue Team's reserve under its first commander, General Délisa Garay, it departed from Ravensburg near Lake Constance on September 18th. The division moved north to conduct reconnaissance and security operations in the Stuttgart region, a roughly 80-kilometer or 50-mile night movement. Red Team created a 25-kilometer breach east of Stuttgart using nuclear weapons. There were 2 corridors big enough to pass their 2 first echelon regiments. Initially, the division maintained a screen parallel to the enemy armored division's southward movement east of Munzingen. During this time, it harassed enemy columns with short attacks described as pinpricks, but on the 20th rapidly shifted to do the same along a second axis of advance between Rüdlingen and Balingen. It's noted that there was a lag in the nuclear breaches, accounting for different enemy rates of advance. This was done to impart more training value on the exercise. If the enemy regiments had passed through at the same time, this screen would have taken place on the Danube to the south. Following, they moved south, conducting a delaying action east of Ebingen to buy time for friendly forces to counterattack. While delaying enemy units traveling south, the division executed a wet gap crossing over the Danube River south of Stettin. This was enabled by the 57th Engineer Battalion, which erected an M2 Bailey Bridge and 3 M4 floating bridges. The exercise raised some questions regarding the 7th DMR's future. First, whether they should add a third combined arms regiment, which would allow the division to weigh 2 against the enemy's main effort, while maintaining a third to tackle a secondary axis of advance. Secondly, the division's artillery strength was rated as weak, but adding more artillery could reduce its mobility and increase its logistical requirements, which were particularly difficult challenges when conducting raids deep behind enemy lines. Within a month, 7th DMR participated in a larger exercise under the US 7th Corps, Cordon Bleu, from October 13th to the 17th, 1955. During this maneuver, 7th DMR played support during a corps-on-corps engagement involving nuclear weapons north of Ulm. It provided a flank guard to the American 5th and 9th Infantry Divisions leading the main attack across the River Main. Friendly and aggressor units met head-on between Stuttgart and Nuremberg. With Honest John nuclear missiles and heavy nuclear artillery in the mix, both sides took heavy notional casualties, with one instance of 1,800 casualties entering 7th Corps' medevac chain at once. At one point, only 2 medics were responsible for the evacuation of 600 men, about an infantry battalion wounded by an atomic blast. On day 3, a battalion from the British 16th Independent Parachute Brigade was notionally dropped south of Würzburg, actually driven there due to bad weather, to secure a bridge over the River Main market garden style. To make the link up, the French 5th Armored Division in reserve was passed through the 7th DMR to make the 50-kilometer dash to the bridge. 7th DMR redeployed northwest to assume a flank guard for the newly inserted French division. While 5th Armored linked up with the Brits south of Oxenfurt, 7th DMR secured the area west of Karlstadt. Later, it would force a crossing there to flank the enemy in support of 5th Armored. They traveled a total of 200 kilometers. The American divisions, meanwhile, had advanced east in the area of Schweinfurt and Bamberg, and were conducting bridging operations over the Main. Of course, in the wake of these nuclear scenarios, 7th DMR was not fully implemented, as France was heavily committed in its Algerian War. In March of 1956, the division deployed to Algeria, leaving behind much of its equipment intended for war in Europe. 7th DMR spent most of their time in the general region around Algiers, with the division HQ at Fort de Leu from June of 1956. By 1958, the division's regiments, reinforced with regiments and battalions from other units, were dispersed throughout a roughly 100 by 35 kilometer area. In mid-1959, 7th DMR moved east to Constantine, replacing the 25th Airborne Division that was blocking aid from Tunisia to the FLN guerrillas, but was transferred to the General Reserve. Its units were then dispersed along the border. Ultimately, 7th DMR didn't persist. Returning to France in 1961, minus some units left in Algeria, the division reorganized as the 7th Armored Division in 1963. Meanwhile, the 10th and 25th Airborne Divisions, organized in an infantry-based Javelot style, were dissolved due to half of their regiment's involvement in the 1961 Algiers Putsch, a failed attempt to prevent Algeria's impending self-determination. Their successor, the 11th Airborne, would be based on brigades. So Javelot went away around the same time as America's Pentomic. But was it better? Kind of. Widely dispersing before rapidly concentrating relied heavily on APCs and helicopters, which the Pentomic Division didn't have enough of. Pentomic divisions could only mechanize one of its 5 battle groups at a time, and aviation was a far cry from what would emerge in the mid-60s. France's 7th DMR, on the other hand, was highly mobile, although it's a bit of an apples and oranges comparison, as the DMR was a smaller, more specialized unit like an American ACR. Pentomic's problem of resupplying isolated units separated by swaths of unsecured land would also have likely been a limitation. By contrast, in Algeria, French sustainment needs were readily met by logistics units providing area support to units in a given zone. This backstop of support was enough in coin, but non-existent in a nuclear war. Ultimately, the French didn't adopt the Javelot structure at division level, but in 1959 it did adopt regiments as larger battalions consisting of 4 to 6 companies, although initially they weren't combined arms. Command and control practices within these regiments were better than in the Potomac Battle Group. Each had 2 tactical headquarters to take command of 2 company groups, basically mini battalions, whereas the Potomac Battle Group HQ was controlling each company individually. The Algerian War and organizational chaos that followed delayed things, so the 1959 division was relatively quickly replaced by the 1967 division. New mechanized brigades featured mechanized regiments similar to Javelot, with 2 AMX-13 light tank squadrons and 2 mechanized infantry companies. Tank regiments, to be re-equipped with AMX-30s in the late 60s, also added a 5th mechanized infantry squadron to their 4 tank squadrons. This was significantly closer to the Javelot inspiration. More radical change came in 1977 when divisions lost their brigades and became based on regiments wholesale. This made divisions much smaller and closer to that original Javelot idea. However, this was more for budgetary reasons and allowed them to form a 3rd Army Corps. Read more about that at battleorder.org/France. And if you'd like to learn more about ill-fated nuclear divisions, check out this video on America's Potomac Division, very similar to Javelot. I'll see you over there.